Hello and welcome back to installment number 4 of the Peninsular War saga on the Napoleonic Wars podcast. We are continuing with the Spanish theme for this installment, and we're going to look at an aspect of the war that I think is overly romanticized on occasion, quite badly misunderstood. And if it's not romanticized, there is a kind of tendency towards gore on this one. We're going to look at the original guerrilla war, the Guerilla, the little war that was waged in Spain over the course of the Peninsular War, and which was fundamental, I would argue, perhaps my esteemed guest will disagree, but I would argue was fundamental to the success of the Allies over the course of the Peninsular War. More on that in a little while. I am joined by Charles Esdaile, Emeritus Professor at the University of Liverpool, author of highly regarded works, including Napoleon's Wars and the Peninsular War, A New History. He made his name bringing the Spanish contribution of the war into the mainstream. If you want regular injections of Charles in your life, then look no further than Napoleonic Quarterly, where he is regularly in, I'm not going to say heated debate, but passionate debate with the equally brilliant Alex Mikaberidze, particularly when it comes to Napoleon. Charles isn't known for his love of Napoleon, to put it mildly. The phrase rat, no, sorry, you likened him to a squirrel, didn't you? A rat with great PR. Charles, welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod. Good to see you. How are you doing?
I'm fine. I'm fine. I am enjoying retirement. I could even describe myself as a gentleman scholar.
Well, I'm glad somebody can, because I certainly can't. Shall we dive straight into this?
Absolutely, my dear fellow.
I mean, I talked about misconceptions at the start, and this is where one of the big things that I think people, if they know about your work, they're going to know your views on Napoleon, and they're probably going to know what you've done to bash the myths about the guerrilla on the head. But we do have, or I say we, people have a misconception. Oh, they're guerrillas, therefore they're patriots. Um, and as I say, you kind of made this your life goal to just sort of wallop this on the head in a kind of historical game of whack-a-mole. When it comes
Well,
to this, what's the reality? Give us the nuance behind some of this. Because yes, okay, some of them were patriots, but equally, some of them are brigands. Let's be honest.
the reality is that in terms of my work, um, all those years ago, when I was doing my PhD on the Spanish Army, I kept coming across original sources which seemed to challenge many of the accepted truths about the Peninsular War. One of them was the whole idea that the Spaniards rose up as one and hurled themselves on the French with their bare hands, and you get this massive people's war. To be blunt, that is mostly invention. It's mostly a 19th century invention. The reality was that people were prepared to fight the French when their own localities were threatened. They were not interested in fighting a national war. If you tried to get a Galician to go marching off to Castile or somewhere, he'd desert. If you tried to get the Catalans to do anything, that was pretty impossible. That's the honest truth. So there were massive problems with the whole idea of this People's War. And then linked in with that, separate perhaps, but linked in, there were all sorts of issues about the guerrillas and what they actually were, and who they were, and also what we mean by guerrilla war. I mean, let me go back to your original statement. You said something to the effect that you believed that the guerrilla war was central to Napoleon's defeat in Spain. Yeah. Okay, well, I have many, many doubts about guerrillas, but I can actually agree with that statement because I interpret it in a rather different way. Most people, if you say to them, I'm writing a book about the Spanish guerrillas, they have visions of people running around the hills in sort of pantomime bullfight costumes, with knives between their teeth and blunderbusses. Yeah. And they think in terms of armed civilians. Well, no, that sort of guerrilla war was supremely unimportant. We'll come back to it. If what you mean, and this is what I mean, is, to use the English term, the little war, a war of flying columns of regular troops marching hither and yon, appearing where the French don't expect them, causing all sorts of trouble. That is something very different. And that is something which involved large numbers of Spanish regular troops. It also, from time to time, involved detachments of the Anglo-Portuguese army. To take just one example, in October 1811, you have the action at Arroyo-Molinos de Montañez, which is in the depths of Andalusia. And basically, General Hill, who's in command of the Southern Front, he hears that a French division has gone to forage, I think. I can't remember exactly what it was doing, but anyway, it's tooling around in the depths of Extremadura and decides to launch a surprise attack. And it's an operation which is conducted entirely with regular troops, including quite a number of well-known British regiments, and there's plenty of British accounts of it. But it's actually part of La Guerilla, the little war. So I think that we have to have a rather different conception of what we mean by the little war. Let me put it another way. A century or so ago, a French historian called Martinien put together basically a telephone directory of every single French officer who was killed or wounded or died of sickness in the Napoleonic Wars. And it's an incredibly detailed work. I've no idea how he did it in the age before computer technology, but everybody, and I'm not a French expert, but everybody who's in the know seems to absolutely swear by this. Anyway, a Spanish colleague of mine actually got to work on Martinien's lists. And what he did was he if you like, extracted all the information about the Peninsular War. And this is published, and there is this book you can buy, which lists every single French officer killed, wounded, or died of sickness. And what's more, where they were killed, and in what circumstances in some cases. Now, of those 2,000, I think it's 2,800 names or something. I mean, the casualties are much smaller. The number of French combat dead is only about 34,000. And the number of, the total number of dead in the peninsula is about 100,000. You can work this out by extrapolating upwards from the number of officers.
Okay, so just for clarity, so it's 2,800 French officers over the course of the Peninsular War, not over the course of the Napoleonic Wars, I'm guessing, because that would be
of the Peninsular War.
Okay, yeah, I'm with you. Sorry, carry on.
And you can extrapolate upwards to about 34,000 combat deaths. I forget what the precise ratio is. It's sort of one officer for every 11 men or something. I forget exactly. Anyway, of those 34,000 deaths, 50% can be shown to have taken place in actions which were the work of the Spanish regular army alone. 31% come from actions where at least some foreign troops were involved, and in some cases where it's completely foreign troops. So Albuera, for example, was a battle in which regular Spanish troops took part, but along with British and Portuguese troops. So Albuera would be in that category. So that's 31%. If you do the maths, you will discover that that leaves just 19% for irregular combatants, which means that irregulars accounted for no more than about 8,000 of the French combat losses. You can strip that down still further, and I've done a lot of work on Andalusia. I mean, one of the books I published was it's called Outpost to Empire, Napoleonic Andalusia. There's an area, a mountainous area, kind of near Cadiz, called the Serranía de Ronda, and there's supposed to be a great insurrection in the Serranía, and these were a terrible nuisance, and this was sort of classic, if you like, idealized guerrilla war stuff, with armed civilians and people running around with knives and blunderbusses. And the number of officers that they killed, and therefore the number of men that they killed, was it 5 officers they managed to kill? It was something like that. It was something ridiculously low, and you can see the whole thing has just been talked up. So when you're talking about guerrilla war, you have to be very, very careful and very precise about what you mean.
Okay, so let's cycle back to the original question then, in terms of this idea that guerrillas are patriots. Would you therefore not define the guerrilla bands as truly part of the guerrilla, or is that taking your argument too far?
It's very, very complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sorry, it just is complicated. I mean, I wrote a book called Fighting Napoleon, Guerrillas, Bandits and Adventurers in Spain. And I had a terrible job writing it because it was so difficult to get my head around. Okay. Spain is a country that was completely overrun with bandits prior to 1808. The country was in just a terrible economic state. And obviously, the worse things get, the more crime you get, basically. Okay. And the French army marches into this chaotic situation. And it finds itself coexisting with bandits. Now, bandits are interested in plunder. Frenchmen have money. Therefore, if they catch a Frenchman on his own, they will happily do him big time. On top of that, torture was a standard part of Spanish banditry. Bandit gangs are very small. They were often 2 pairs of brothers, for example. So it'd be 4 guys, 5 guys. And such groups need bonding rituals. It's about trust. having confidence in people, showing that you belong, showing that you can, if you'll forgive the phrase, hack it. And so torture becomes very important. And it's absolutely habitual, because if you torture your victims, it becomes like a sort of blood pact. And yeah, I mean, it was nasty stuff. I mean, the typical tortures were things like sticking somebody's feet into the fire. And the French were treated exactly the same. And that's where you get these stories of atrocities coming from. Now, okay, Spain goes to war with Napoleon and introduces conscription, which is hugely unpopular. And so you get large numbers of young men running away from their homes. And they take to the mountains. What do? They haven't got anything to live on. They become bandits. So the problem starts to sort of spiral. And then lots of Spanish soldiers who are in the army, they desert, or they get cut off after some battle, and they become bandits. So you've got this seething mass of bandits. In amongst those masses of bandits, you have got a few forward-thinking individuals, a few guys who've actually got brains. And they realize that if they carry on just being bandits, they're going to end up dead. Either the French will shoot them, or garrote them, or whatever, or the Spaniards will. So it's a lot better to actually somehow connect to the Spanish authorities. That way, they start getting money. They start getting arms. They start they've been given things like official commissions and things like that. And so a number of these figures emerge, and they start to form, if you like, miniature armies. Private armies, if you want. And many of the sort of the big names amongst the guerrillas are people who do this. People like Juan Martín Díez and Petinado, for example. Francisco Espoz Mina in Navarre, for example. Not his real name, might come back to that. Juan Palarea in La Mancha. There's a number of these figures. And they form small regular units. And they do that because they realize that this keeps them in with the Spanish government. It means that the French will treat them as prisoners of war. It's simply not true that the French hang and shoot everybody. It means that they've got more control over their followers. It means that they're more successful in their military operations, which means they've got a greater chance of surviving. But also it means that they get more plunder. It means that they get more followers. It means that they get more reputation. So from this chaotic milieu, you get the emergence of increasingly powerful, increasingly effective private armies. And very often, and especially Mina does this in Navarre, they will suppress the bandits around them. They will take out the leaders, and they will basically impress the men into their ranks. And these units gradually get subsumed into the Spanish army. So they end up leading brigades, ultimately leading divisions. Now, guerrillas like that can be quite effective. But increasingly, they are not irregulars. They are regular soldiers conducting at least semi-regular operations. Now, alongside them, you have the Spanish regular army and the Spanish authorities. The Spanish authorities were actually quite well aware of the value of guerrilla bands, and they tried to encourage the formation of guerrilla bands, which they hope will become militarized and so forth. The trouble is that often what they're doing is encouraging the formation of just more bandits. Yeah. But okay, and they're also aware of the value of low-level operations. So they will do things like send entire divisions out into the blue. The chap called Pedro Villacampa, who's a very good example, who was very active in southern Aragon. And he's basically a brigadier in the regular army who marches off with his brigade into the hills and causes havoc. Another character, another name to conjure with, is Francisco Ballesteros, who's actually eventually becomes the commander of the Spanish Fourth Army down in Cadiz. And originally, he was a divisional commander. He was actually originally up in Asturias, and he brought his division down to join what's called the Army of the Left, and then eventually ends up in Andalusia. And he spends most of 1811 marching up and down the wilds of Western Andalusia, beating up the French, or not, as the case may be. He was also very good at not beating up the French and taking himself off. So what you've got is a picture in which the little war cannot be denied, and I do not deny it. The issue is what the little war is made up of, who's doing it, and are they heroes? Are they liberators, or are they bandits? And the thing is that it's very, very difficult to draw the line.
I think you've put that together really nicely, and that really neatly lays out the complexity of this. It also explains why you have people like Carlos de España suddenly being deployed with Wellington when he's at Salamanca, and this sort of this integration. It all sort of suddenly makes a lot more sense.
Well, Carlos de España wasn't a guerrilla; he was a regular military commander. No. The person you might be thinking of is Julian Sanchez.
That might be who I'm thinking of, yeah.
Yes. Julian Sanchez is an interesting character. He was a tenant farmer of some type from the area of Ciudad Rodrigo. He had seemingly, it's all a bit mysterious, he'd seemingly served in the regular army, probably in a cavalry unit. And when the uprising breaks out in 1808, he signs up for the town militia. You get what is called the Voluntarios de Ciudad Rodrigo, the volunteers of Ciudad Rodrigo. And it is a town militia. They had no intention of going anywhere but Ciudad Rodrigo. And a lot of these militias are formed to actually get people out of the war. I mean, there's a hilarious example. There's a guerrilla band which is formed by the Junta de Ayamonte. Ayamonte is this nowhere place right down in the southwestern corner of Andalusia, and they form a guerrilla band in either late 1808 or early 1809, when there are no French for hundreds of miles. And what these guys are basically enforcers for the local bigwigs. It's not about fighting the French at all. Anyway, okay, Julian Sanchez. he joins the militia, and he gets to be the commander of a cavalry patrol put together. Eventually becomes a cavalry squadron. The French close in on the city, and incidentally, he has a regular commission. The voluntarios that he left going, are acknowledged.
Yeah.
And so they're given commissions and so forth. And the French close in. Julian Sanchez breaks out. You don't need cavalry at a siege, and he escapes into the Sierra de Francia, which is down to the southwest. And then he spends the winter of 1810 to 1811 effectively fighting a guerrilla war. Most of his men, or at least his original men, were regular soldiers. They're part of the militia, but they're still effectively part of the army. They draw in waifs and strays. People have to survive. And it's a very, very poor part of Spain. And so by the time that Wellington and company come back from Forest of Thrash and so forth and march back over the frontier, Julian Sanchez is in command of, well, it's called a brigade, a cavalry brigade. And there's apparently 2 regiments and lancers. And he becomes a regular soldier. Or he never wasn't a regular soldier. He goes back to being a regular soldier. And then so he operates alongside Wellington's army, alongside Carlos de España, who you mentioned earlier, who is, if I recall, a divisional commander in what was then the Spanish Fifth Army. So Julian Sanchez is a classic example. Is the man a guerrilla? Is he a regular soldier? And also, you have to ask, was he also somebody who was busily feathering his own nest? Now, I've never read anything decent about. I'll just say, a decent study about Julian Sanchez, but one story is that he made a fortune from stealing horses. And certainly by the end of the war, he is a wealthy man. As I say, guerrillas, bandits, and adventurers.
Absolutely. And what you say there, just that last bit about lining their own pockets, actually chimes very nicely with what Sylvia was saying in the last episode of this series about how in those early days when the Brits seemed rather inclined to just sort of hurl money at various Spaniards and say, yes, start an insurrection against the French, here's some money to make it so. The distribution of those funds is sometimes sort of inventive in terms of whose pocket it actually ends up in.
But you see what happens with regard to the new authorities, the juntas. They're often portrayed as being revolutionary authorities, and they are in a sense in that they effectively the whole insurrection of 1808 is a sort of declaration of the sovereignty of the people. And so they are supposedly the representatives of the people. But they're not revolutionary figures. They're all drawn from the old authorities, the old structures of power, the old structures of political power, administrative power, ecclesiastical power, but also economic power. These are caciques, to use the term you get in later Spanish history, the bigwigs. And they've got absolutely no intention of doing anything other than running their little areas for their own benefit. So, for example, the appointment of officers to the army. all of these provincial juntas actually chuck commissions around right, left, and centre. Ballesteros is a good example. Ballesteros was a junior officer in the Customs Guard. And when I say Customs Guard, I'm not talking about the Carabineros of later days. I'm talking about little anti-bandit patrols who were themselves inclined to banditry. And anyway, he's a very, very junior figure, and he gets made a brigadier, like overnight. So, and who are they giving commissions to? They're giving them to their cronies and their friends. Why do you see the formation of so many new regiments? Because each new regiment needs officers. Each new regiment needs a surgeon. Each new regiment needs a bandmaster. It's all about jobs for the boys. And that's one of the reasons why the Spanish army is in such a mess, because so many of the new officers really are absolutely hopeless. So yeah, I mean, there is a huge amount of peculation, and the idea of patriotism is still quite far in the future. I mean, I've read a lot about Spanish nationalism, the growth of Spanish nationalism, and most academics in Spain believe that nationalism is something that only comes into existence in the course of the 19th century.
Which, of course, would be consistent with the growth of nationalism in other European nations.
Oh, absolutely, actually. Absolutely.
You know, even within Britain at this point in time, this is the classic Linda Colley argument, isn't it? That really the only thing that your average person is kind of using in terms of defining what it means to be British is, well, we're not French, because we're just not. You know, we've been fighting them for however long. So that's not all that surprising, really, is it?
And certainly a lot of the traditional stuff that we have about the guerrilla war is actually the fruit of sort of 19th century invention.
Well, it's a good origin story, isn't it? You know, you can take that moment and say, look, here's a point where, you know, nationalist fervor that we're starting to actually see develop mid or in late 19th century Europe. You can use that as an origin story if you're Spanish and you're trying to trace the roots of Spanish nationalism.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, the idea of this People's War against Napoleon suited everybody. Because on the one hand, on the right, you know, if you feared change, if you feared progress, if you hated socialism and all the rest of it, you could say, well, look what happens in 1808. The heroic Spanish people rise up against the French. And okay, they're fighting the French, but what they're really fighting is French-style innovation. They're not interested in the Enlightenment. They're not interested in liberalism. You know, and they see it as a regressive movement. The people on the left in Spain, radicals, progressives, ultimately socialists, the war is something very different. They still want a national movement. They still want a great crusade. But for them, it's about the Spanish people recovering their own liberty. And that, in fact, was the argument you get put forward by the liberals in the Cortes of Cádiz. You know, Spain needs a constitution because the Spanish people have risen up to reclaim their rights. I'll give you a very good example, though, of how these stories get put together. You will, I presume, have heard of Augustina of Aragon.
Do you know what? She's actually in my list of questions, which incidentally I should say has just been scattered to the five winds by listening to this because I'm looking down the list and I'm going, yeah,
Sorry,
no,
Zach.
no, don't
I'm
apologize,
terrible.
Charles. No, no, don't apologize in the slightest. But it's if people could see my list of questions, it would be incredibly amusing to see me go through the list as I do these interviews and go, yeah, that's not relevant anymore. He's basically answered that. That's clearly absolute nonsense. So we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. So you're basically rewriting the interview for me as we go. But yeah, Augustina is one of those because it's always struck me that it makes a great picture, right? You know, you've got this lady there manning a cannon and all of that, and it's a great thing to sort of create that image that people can latch onto in an almost Gilray-esque style.
Well,
And
that is exact. Very odd about the Gilray business because there is a famous cartoon um, showing a heroic British grenadier backed by hordes and hordes and hordes of the Spaniards, complete with nuns waving cutlasses and
absolutely, yeah.
bishops on donkeys. If you look
Spanish
at
patriots attacking French banditti, loyal Britain's lending a lift for those
that's
who
it,
want to go and
that's
look it
it.
up.
And
Which tells you I know far too much about caricatures from this period that I can just name it like that. But sorry, let me allow you to carry on.
no, Zach, you are a very erudite fellow, and you know, would I suggest anything else? Am I surprised? No. Okay, but in the corner of that picture, and that picture that was produced in June 1808, very, very early on, there is an Agustina of Aragon type figure loading a cannon. I didn't notice it for ages, and I said, well, what's that doing there? But it's before Agustina is known about at all. Now, okay, where does Agustina of Aragon come from? Well, let's begin with her real name. Her real name is Agustina Zaragoza Domenech. Please note Zaragoza. And she is the wife of a gunner in the regular army who was in the garrison of Barcelona. And in fact, Agustina Zaragoza Domenech, she's got a Catalan matronym, so she's part Catalan. And like many Spanish soldiers, I mean, what the French did in Barcelona was they basically turned the Spanish garrison loose. They just let them disappear into the blue because they were just a nuisance. If you just let them go, you wouldn't have to guard them or anything. Okay, so quite a few of these guys make their way westwards and they get to Zaragoza. So this chap becomes part of the garrison of Zaragoza, and his wife is just a camp follower. In one of the French attacks on the city, I think it's the 2nd of July 1808, Agustina is carrying water to the walls. And she goes to the bastion where her husband is. She goes up, and just as she gets there, just before she gets there, there's a big explosion. Probably, the ready powder went up. Big explosion. Everybody's killed. So she arrives in this scene of carnage, and the French are just about to pour over the walls. So she rushes over to the cannon, snatches up a linstock, fires the cannon in their faces. Now, did something like that happen? Probably. Though we don't know for certain. It's all very vague. But cut to the commander of the city, who is this demagogue called Jose Palafox. And Palafox was a dreadful military leader. He was an appalling general, but he was a genius when it came to propaganda. And defending Zaragoza was actually all about getting Palafox to be regent of Spain, allowing him to basically push through a certain political program. He'd been very heavily involved in the coup against Godoy and the aristocratic front against Charles IV and so forth. So anyhow, he's somebody who wants to go places and he wants to sell himself. And his story reaches him. And you can basically see the light bulb go off in his head. In the first place, Augustina Zaragoza. She is literally Ms. Zaragoza. What's the name? Everything. Secondly, Palafox was like many Spaniards, the upper class is quite cultivated. And I can't prove this, I wish I could, but it's very, very probable that he was familiar with a story which had been publicized in the very first history of Canada, which comes out about 1763. And it's all about the girl who saves the fort. And it's about a young girl, and she was some border fort, somewhere in Montreal or somewhere. And her father's a governor, and he's called away on business or got off and made some villages or something or other. And she's left in the fort with one or two retainers and so forth. And the Indians appear and they attack the fort. And she drives them off by going onto the ramparts and firing a cannon at them. And you can see Jose Palafox putting 2 and 2 together and making 4. I have got this brilliant asset. So he talks up Augustina massively because he's a very demagogic figure. He wants to keep it with the crowd. And he creates this national heroine. Now, did she actually fire a cannon at the French? Possibly. Does she go on to be a great guerrilla commander and all the other things which are written about her? Definitely not. She becomes a sort of mascot, and who is, who eventually ends up in Seville and Cadiz, I think, eventually. And Jose Palafox, gives her a commission in the army. And because she's such a public figure, this has to be honoured and so forth. But I mean, effectively, she's a totally invented figure, and that sort of invention, either at the time of the war or later, in the subsequent years, is central to if you like the traditional history of the guerrillas. And why we need to be so careful in accepting it.
And for folks who are slightly skeptical and perhaps feeling slightly put out, because I mean most people think of Augustina of Aragon, she's, because of the hype that's been attached to her, lots of people kind of think that her story is word for word what happens, and you see that story being churned out many times and repeated so many times to this day, right? Yeah, so for those who were,
it's emblematic of the whole war. I mean, I remember a very good friend of mine in Zaragoza. I was there for the bicentenary, and it was the usual round of conferences and military parades and public concerts and all the rest of it. And he said to me, he said, Carlos, he said, when all of this is over, I swear to God that the people of Spain will still think, people of Zaragoza, people of Spain will still think that all the Peninsular War was about, all the War of Independence about, was Augustina of Aragon running out with her, and firing a cannon, and the French running away, and that was the end of it.
But this isn't unusual. That's where I'm getting at with this. That people will be thinking, oh, but I've read this in books, and this is established history, and yet this myth making process isn't that unusual. And I don't usually like drawing examples across different conflicts, but the fundamentals behind this are the same, so it works. Take the myth of the Blitz. There's a great book by, I believe it was Angus Calder, but by exactly that title. And he basically lays out, it's quite an old book now, but he basically lays out that all of these ideas of sort of Blitz spirit, there are kernels of that in there, but actually there's a heck of a lot that we just very conveniently forget, where people really weren't coming together. You know, people disappearing from their homes into air raid shelters was a godsend to thieves, especially in blacked out streets. You know, there was a lot going on at that point that actually takes this idea of people pulling together and sort of very much kind of flies in the face of it. And in time, I imagine there will be equivalents about things like COVID. You know, in fact, we even saw this kind of effort to mythologize to an extent when it came to the London Olympics. You know, ideas that the entire nation stopped and watched X happen. When it comes to COVID, I imagine they will quietly forget the actions of certain individuals that very much flew in the face of restrictions. And no, I'm not making a political point there as we move rapidly on. But the point is that this is a process that people do. They take a version and they emphasize certain stories within that, and then in time it becomes the accepted history.
And
so
it becomes very difficult to challenge it.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I've had Spaniards. It's funny. I have a very mixed reception in Spain. There are many Spaniards who love me, and you know, and that's very kind of them. And you know, many Spaniards who are very appreciative of my work. Even write very nice reviews. There are and who can often used to welcome me as a sort of a breath of fresh air. Um, I was once called by Heraldo de Aragon, which is the regional paper of Zaragoza. I was once called the enfant terrible of the Peninsular War, which, yeah, I love that. And you know, I was regularly getting up and taking on these sort of myths and saying, well, no, it wasn't like that. But there are many Spaniards who hated me for it. You know, who, I mean, they would, one classic line was, you know, you're English, so you can't understand.
Yeah, we get this a lot with Napoleon as well, don't we? Oh, well, you're British, so therefore you're instantly biased in, and that's why you don't like Napoleon. You sort of go,
Yeah,
no, hang on a minute.
Anybody who tries that on Twitter for me gets blocked.
Hmm.
I mean, really, I do. I mean, I'm not having that because that is a completely inappropriate way to approach historical debate.
Well, yeah, I mean, it rather misses the point that you do this as a job, right? And you have done for however many years. And in the process, you've got the skills that mean that you can make that kind of judgment yourself. And sure, people come to different conclusions. That's the fun of it. You know, you probably are one of the more vociferous Bonaparte detractors, but that doesn't mean that it's because you're biased by your national identity. It's a case of that's how you interpreted the material in front of you.
I mean, if you read my my Peninsular War carefully, or indeed my Wars of Napoleon, and you don't have to read that carefully. I mean, there is a chapter in the Wars of Napoleon called Perfidious Albion, and you know I'm openly critical of many aspects of the British state and the British war effort. So I'm quite capable of being critical of the British myth, but I just believe, I really genuinely believe that it is the job of the historian to identify myths and deconstruct them, because otherwise history becomes a perversion.
I'm nodding energetically at this point because I have been mulling over a proposal for a book that's sort of something like top 10 myths of the Napoleonic Wars, that just deconstructs them. I think it's all you need. Don't start stealing that idea, people who are listening. Don't you dare start submitting that proposal, because I'm working on that. So I'm with you, Charles. Absolutely. There are a lot of
for
myths
what
that
it's
need
worth, Zach, I
punishing.
mean, and I think it's a very good idea, and I, if it comes my way as a potential, somebody wants to ask my opinion on it, I'll say it's a very good idea, and I'll say that you're a very good guy. But as you may have noticed on Twitter, there's been a long debate about Waterloo.
I might have been responsible for that. I might have taken to just sort of posting provocative questions that are designed to get people
So
milling around, and it does tend to
it's
descend into this.
well, I mean, good in a sense, because the more Bonapartist heads that pop up, the more targets I've got to smack, basically.
Are you not a fan of people who like Napoleon, Charles?
No,
But you've disguised that distaste so well, nobody would know.
I try to smack their heads courteously. I do it with love. Well,
Okay, I'm not sure they necessarily see it as that. We've gone a long way from the guerrillas, haven't we? We should probably get back
oh,
to the guerrilla.
yeah,
But
we should. But what I was
yeah,
going to say though, just about that was that I've actually thought of putting a series of tweets on Twitter saying, here are a series of myths about Waterloo. No, Napoleon did not see the Prussians coming. There is a hill in the way, and so on and so forth. But right, back to the guerrillas.
yes. I mean, we've talked about the ways in which they could work quite neatly. We've talked about this sort of distinction that needs to be drawn between the ones who are wholesale bandits and the ones who are really sort of semi-regular or even fully regular, have a commission, then they end up having to leg it, and so they're in the hills for a bit, and then they go back into sort of a more formal role. One of the things that I do want to talk about, and what was always struck me as one of the most important successes, um, is intelligence gathering, and this is where I'm curious about how this fits with what you've said already, because for me, had it not been for the intelligence that Wellington's able to gather, courtesy of the varying types of guerrilla bands that are out there, suddenly his ability to wage war would have become infinitely harder. You know, Wellington doesn't operate in the same level of fog of war as you might expect because of the interception of French dispatches. Um, so talk us through what your take is on that. You know, am I just kind of swallowing an accepted truism that's kind of missing the point there? Because
Yes, to an extent.
okay, so
Um,
enlighten us.
yes, of course. You've got plenty of examples where dispatches fall into Wellington's hands, and in some cases, the provenance of those documents are indeed guerrillas, bandits. But remember that bandits aren't stupid. You know, what's the first thing they do after they've knifed a Frenchman or had fun sticking his feet in the fire or whatever else they want to do? They're going to go through his sabotage. They're going to go through his haversack. Oh, what have we got here? Oh, look, it's a sealed document. I know what we can do with those. We can sell them. Yeah. So I do have to say I have doubts about the patriotic business. But the other thing is that a huge amount of the information that Wellington gets is actually not from guerrillas; it's from spies. or as they were called, correspondents. And these are chaps who do not take to the hills. They go on being butchers and bakers and candlestick makers, minor officials, churchmen. I mean, a famous example is Patrick Curtis, who's the boss of the Irish College at Salamanca. And they write to Wellington. He refers to them as correspondents. Now you've got an equally, and this aspiring, if you like, it becomes more and more developed. The Spaniards also have a very, very highly developed intelligence operation. And they're passing information as well. So yeah, and the whole intelligence question is very, very important. But again, I would be cautious about saying, it was all the guerrillas.
Mm-hmm. Psychologically, for the French, how significant is this kind of concept that there are chunks of the countryside that you've got to be careful where you go and what you do? Is there a kind of a toll, or is it the case that actually, if you're your average Frenchman in the French army, you're not particularly conscious of a hostile population, and you stay with your regiment most of the time anyway, except for when you're foraging?
No, I wouldn't minimise the effect on the French army, the psychological effect on the French army. If you take the question of atrocities, yes, if you fell into the hands of a bandit gang, very, very nasty things were going to happen. Not because you were French, especially, because you were in the hands of a bandit gang. That's what they did. The trouble is that those stories start doing the rounds. And, yeah, I mean, some people actually undoubtedly saw horrible things. They come across people, nailed to trees or whatever. But far more people hear the stories. Those stories circulate and they build and they build and they build and they build and they build. And all sorts of rumors are flying about. And it's not just sort of bandits in the hills. It's sort of young girls seducing French soldiers and then having them murdered in the back kitchen or whatever. And there is, I think, a real atmosphere of terror. But if you deconstruct a lot of the stories that you get in the French memoirs, and I've read dozens and dozens and dozens of French memoirs in the Peninsular War. If you deconstruct the stories of torture, you find that they're very often repeating the same stories, word for word. And it often comes back to sort of poor General René being sawn in half at La Carabina in June 1808 and so forth. What happens in June 1808, immediately prior to the Battle of Bailén in La Mancha, the area south of Madrid, is that General Dupont, who'd been ordered to march to Cadiz, he marches off across La Mancha and across the Sierra Morena into Andalusia. And he leaves behind a chain of hospitals, soldiers who've fallen out en route, supply depots, and you've also got supply wagons trundling down to Andalusia behind him and so forth. He's got a line of communications. Now, at the beginning of the war, Spain experiences almost like the grand peur of the French Revolution, great fear, panic, terror. And many Spaniards, because of the way in which the story of the Dos de Mayo has been put about, the idea is put about the French deliberately set out to massacre all the people of Madrid, entire populace. There is this massive panic, and these hospitals are set upon, and there are a series of massacres. And a number of, like General Rene, he was murdered at La Carolina, but he wasn't sawed in half. And these stories are wildly inflated. I mean, you get stories about people being boiled in oil, and well, most Spanish peasants are desperately poor. They're not going to waste oil on cooking a Frenchman, you know. So these stories, really, really get about, and they're repeated over and over again. But if you deconstruct them, you can trace many of them back to sort of quite an isolated series of cases. And as for bandit gangs, well, how many Frenchmen do they actually lay their hands on? A few, not many. So again, you can see this whole process of invention, exaggeration, and yet in this case it is important because there's no doubt in my mind it did wear down French morale very significantly. Spain was not a destination people wanted to go to, and that helps wear down support for Napoleon in France, which of course by 1814 is non-existent.
Indeed, a topic that you're well known for sallying forth on. I want to stay with this kind of brutality element for a minute, not for the sake of being gory for gory's sake, but we talk a lot about sort of reprisal, counter reprisal, lots of atrocities being committed. How much of that is overplayed? Because there is a very strong tradition in telling the story of the Peninsular War of French atrocity, and we have evidence of that, not just in Spain, also in Portugal. Think about what happens, what the British see when they march back north after Massena's withdrawal over the winter of 1810-11. How much have we been guilty of sort of taking a few instances and just focusing so much on those that actually it's been overplayed, and perhaps there was less bloodshed being committed by the French and therefore by extension the Spanish in counter reprisals over the course of this war?
Certainly. Again, you have a great deal of exaggeration. Yes, I mean, wherever the French armies went, they did dreadful things. I mean, that is quite clear.
Sorry, just a sort of subsidiary question to that. Is that also true elsewhere in Europe, or is there something unique about what happens in the Iberian Peninsula?
It's not entirely unique. French armies were always pretty rough and ready. But the thing is that in Spain and Portugal, you've got a sense of the population being the other in a way in which you don't get it in, say, Germany. These people were uncivilized. They were savages. They were beyond the pale. They were resisting, the benefits of French knowledge and enlightenment and so forth, and that meant that they were rejecting reason. And what is the basis of humanity? Reason. These people weren't people. So yeah, I mean, French atrocity was worsened by that, and it was worsened by the fact that there were these horrible stories of tortures circulating. It was worsened by the fact that Spain was, a pretty dreadful place to be. The wine was awful, apart from anything else. There's, seriously, French soldiers talk about this. The moment you cross the Bidassoa, the frontier river, you know, you're in another country, you're on another planet. You've gone back 200 years, you've gone back 400 years. In terms of execution and counter-execution, that I think has been exaggerated. If you fell into the hands of the French and you were clearly a brigand, you would get shot or garroted. The number of public garrottings at the hands of the police court set up by the Josefino regime is about 750 or something. So yeah, and there are plenty more who were subjected to fairly summary execution. If you were wearing a uniform, if you were a regular soldier, the chances were that you would be treated as a regular soldier. And that would often apply on both sides. You know, Frenchmen who were taken prisoner were not necessarily shot out of hand. There was an episode in Navarre where the governor of Navarre shot 50 Spanish prisoners, and so Esdaile shoots 50 French prisoners, and then they decided this is a bad idea, really, and they stopped doing it. Yeah, so I think that's been exaggerated. But to go back to sort of mythologization, one thing we might talk about here is Goya's famous etchings, the disasters of war. Very mixed bag. Some of the stuff he drew from life, some of the stuff he did see, but it's not the stuff that you think about. The stuff he saw, there's a series of engravings that show the dreadful famine in Madrid in 1812, and that's taken from life. Some of the execution scenes where you have people actually being garroted on the scaffold, that's probably taken from life. But he spent most of the war in Madrid. He was also quietly a Josefino. And actually his disasters of war, the real title wasn't the disasters of war. It was the unfortunate consequences of Spain's war against Napoleon. Very, very ambiguous. And Goya hated the plebs. He regarded them as a bunch of savages. And early in his career, you've got what's called the tapestries or the cartoons or something, where he paints these very idyllic pictures of young Spanish men and women enjoying themselves at picnics and things like that. Increasingly moves away from that. You can see it becomes more and more cynical, darker and darker. And he hates the plebs, he fears the plebs. And what he's painting, what he's showing, is the consequences of the plebs running amok. And a lot of these dreadful torture scenes and so forth that you see are actually products of his imagination. And they're very, very ambiguous. You might think you're seeing French soldiers do it to Spanish civilians. Actually, you don't know what you're seeing. But again, people take the Goya engravings as the real thing. Something else which messes things up with regard to Goya is, of course, his paintings of the 2nd of May and the 3rd of May. These are great patriotic canvases. Well, he paints them in 1814. Ferdinand VII has come back. He's got to get back into favour somehow. Do you see what I mean? That wheels have been wheels, been wheels.
Absolutely. It goes back to a point that was made very recently in a talk I was at, that every single source has a bias inherent in it, because everything is created for a reason. And so you've got the idea that you've got these completely unbiased sources that aren't created through having a particular agenda. is obviously rubbish. But you've got to be very careful in working out what that agenda is, because people aren't constant over time. And that can also have its role to play.
And of course, I mean, Goya paints famously in the picture of the 2nd of May, you've got the Mamluks. So, Spaniards are convinced that the Mamluks were settlers, Napoleon settlers, the Moors on Spain. Yeah, 35 of them. Honest. I'm not making it up.
No, so I'm sort of quietly chuckling here. But no, yeah, you make a very good point, and it sort of taps into sort of you said it yourself, the whole thing of conflict with the Moors and all the rest of it. I suppose we need to start wrapping this up, which is a shame, because we could keep kind of talking about topics around this theme for a while. I'm not going to ask you about the Afranthosaurus, which I hope I've pronounced vaguely correctly.
I'll give you about an 8 out of 10 for it.
Well, I'll take that, considering that it's one of about 12 Spanish words that I can actually pronounce. So we might save that for another episode, actually, because there's a whole interesting story perhaps to tell there. I guess a lot of people are going to want to try and read up on this, aside from your assorted books, which we'll talk about in just a moment. In terms of surviving accounts by guerrillas, what is there out there that's worth engaging in, rather than just something that's written for all of the hype and an individual purely trying to sort of boss their own reputation?
Your honest truth is that there is very, very little. There are very few Spanish memoirs in the Peninsular War. Very few. Nothing comparable to what you get in Britain or in France. And of the very, very few that there are, the only one I can think of offhand is Esdaile memoirs, which were written up by his widow after he died. And would I trust them further than I can throw them? No, I wouldn't. But the problem, of course, is that there are very, very few other historians who've done a sort of work in the Spanish archives. I mean, in Anglo-Saxon historians, quote unquote, and who produced work which is accessible to Anglophone readers. That means that reading, if people want to read up further, in places other than my work, they have a bit of a problem.
Which is a very neat segue into your work, and there's quite a lot of it. Peninsular War Eyewitness springs to mind. I had that out of the library just this week. The Peninsular War: A New History. Varying books. You mentioned one of them. What was it? Fighting Napoleon, Guerrillas, Bandits, and
Adventures. Yeah, Outpost of Empire. The Napoleonic occupation of Andalusia, Spanish Army in the Peninsular War, the Duke of Wellington, the commander of the Spanish Army.
That was your first one, wasn't it? That was based on the PhD that you did.
The Spanish Army was, yeah. And then the Duke of Wellington, the commander of the Spanish Army, came out of it. Women in the Peninsular War.
Indeed. So, folks, a lot for you to go and fill your bookshelves with if you want to start to really sort of mine the depths of the very complex realities of this guerrilla, where everything kind of really isn't what it seems. Charles, great to talk to you as ever. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.
Yeah, my pleasure, Zach, and we will talk again.
Folks, if you've enjoyed this show, please do me a favor. Head over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave a 5-star review. If you're not a regular listener, remember to hit that subscribe button so you can find your way back. All of those things are incredibly powerful in helping this show to reach a wider audience. Much love, as ever, to all my Patreon supporters. Shout outs to my Mentioned in Dispatches patrons: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Lucy Tatner, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Coulson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, David Graylick, Ted Andrews, David Milinski, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Merlon, and Darla Vincent. And the Admirals, John Haynes, Ryan Diamond, J.C. Kaiser, Bob Burnham, Mike Guest, Liam Telfer, Todd and Ned Campbell, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Maxwell, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Mark Chestnut, and Jason Morn. I'll be back very soon, but until then, I'm Zach White. This has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.